Hi guys, today I am going to discuss ethical obligation state in era of globalization. This is Mr. SP Sitarehind. Currently, I am going to take a lecture GS Ethics fourth paper, Ethics, Integrity, Aptitude. Let's start. What is ethical obligation? What is ethical obligation? What is ethical obligation? What is ethical obligation? An ethical obligation, something that is required an ethical obligation, something that somebody is required or compelled to do something based on predetermined set of standard of what is right and wrong. For example, ethical obligation, something that is ethical obligation, something that is ethical obligation, something that is required or required ethical obligation, something that is required or compelled to do or compelled to do or compelled to do based on predetermined compelled to do based on predetermined set of standard predetermined set of standard predetermined set of standard of what is right and wrong, of what is right and wrong. Understood? The means of ethical obligation, something that is required or compelled to do based on predetermined set of standard of what is right and wrong. The means of ethical obligation. Got my point? Next, for example, if you just want to understand, the example is that doctor have an ethical obligation to do no harm while diagnosing, treating patient. Listen again. Doctors have an ethical obligation to do no harm while diagnosing, treating patient. For instance, doctors have no an ethical obligation have an ethical obligation. Doctor has, doctors have an ethical obligation. Doctors have an ethical obligation to do no harm, to do no harm, to do no harm while diagnosing, treating, while diagnosing, while diagnosing, while diagnosing and treating people, and treating people. Understood? For instance, doctors have an ethical obligations to do no harm while diagnosing or treating people. It means that only to understand, when doctors are treating to patient, it is very essential to have an ethical obligation for patient. Next, next point, ethical obligation are things a person must or should do based on code of ethics. Ethical obligation is only based on code of ethics. Ethical obligation is based on code of ethics. Code of ethics. Code of ethics. Ethical obligation is based on code of ethics. Ethical obligation are things a person must or should do based on a code of ethics. Ethics are not inherently but based on laws, religion, or one's personal feeling. Laws, religion, one's personal feeling, one's personal feeling. Laws, religion, one's personal feeling. Ethics are not inherently based on laws, religions, or one's feelings, but it is for professional like liar, lawyer, doctors, doctors can be codified into law, can be codified into law. My point. Next, for instance, if you just want to understand the example, then it would be happen like that. Lawyers have an ethical obligation state in globalization. State in era of globalization. state in era of globalization. Point 1. The more common view is that 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 a state like other a state like other a state like other bodies corporate bodies can bear obligation State in era of globalization. Point 1. The more common view is that a state like other corporate bodies can bear obligation. Got my point? And other point is that point 2 refer I state have obligation to protect I states have an obligation to protect right of citizen right of citizens. It is the moral duty of the state. Got my point? The moral duty of the state, a state have an obligation to protect right of citizens. It is the moral duty of the state. Next point. Next. They have obligation to keep the to keep their promise respect and the sovereignty of other states and help their allies Next point, they have an obligation to keep their promise, respect and sovereignty of the other states and help their allies. The means of this is only indicate that state have a power to keep promise, respect of their sovereignty and other states allies related to that other state like that. Allies is only referred to the other state. Kinship between that. Next. Next point, it can be denied that people denied. It can be denied that people speak that people speak people speak this way of speaking, this way of speaking, this way of speaking is meaningful language, is meaningful language, is meaningful language is used for corporation, is used for corporation, is used for corporation, religious association, corporation, religious association, religious association, religious association, corporation, and other collective bodies, and other collective bodies, collective bodies, collective bodies. Got my point? It can be denied that people speak this way of speaking is meaningful language. It means meaningful language is only indicate which is very original vernacular statement, is used for corporation and religious association and other collective bodies. 3 word is most important factor. Next, is that states don't act by themselves. States don't act themselves. States don't act themselves. They must be made to act. They must be made to act by leader citizens. States do not act themselves. They must be made to act by leader citizens. It means that we need to understand states have no power to act themselves. It's only helped by the leader citizen. Next, even if state state can be said even if states can be said to have obligation obligation and the leader citizens and the leader citizens and the leader citizens must believe that must believe that must believe that they have a duty to guide the state. Next point, even if state can be said to have obligations and leader citizens must believe that, it means that only to understand citizens, leader citizens believe to the work out of states. It is crux point of the state. Next point is that they don't the obligation the state, they don't the obligation of the state obligation of they don't the obligation of the state obligation of the states are idle of no importance of no importance. They don't the obligation of the states are idle of no importance. Next point, the citizens and rules are the people who decide. The citizens and rulers the citizens and rulers are the people the citizens and rulers or the people who decide what the state does, who decide what the state does, the state does, and they are free to disregard and they are free to disregard a state obligation, if they believe they are spurious, if they believe they are spurious, they are spurious. The citizens and rulers are the people who decide what the state does, or they are free to disregard a state obligation of the belief they are spurious. It is a key rule. Next is that next point, citizens and rulers might believe that citizens citizens and rulers citizens and rulers might believe that might believe that citizens and rulers are might believe that they inherit the state they inherit the state they inherit the state they inherit the state obligation only of the obligation only of the state only of the states only of the states. Liberal democracy liberal democracy liberal democracy liberal democracy point 1 liberal democracy are only if it is coexistence or only if coexistence with the people coexistence with the people. Understood? Citizens and rulers might believe that they inherit the state's obligations only of the state. Liberal democracy are only if coexistence with the people. Next point next point state obligation under international law. State obligation state obligation state obligation under international law international law. State obligations under international law takes the state as the fundamental obligation fundamental obligation. Fundamental obligation. Bearing agent. Bearing agent. Bearing agent. Then it can claim. Then it can claim. Then it can claim no loyalty from the individual. No loyalty from the individual. No loyalty from the individual are grouped upon are grouped upon which the state relies relies for its power. Got my point? State obligations under international law take the state as the fundamental obligation. Take the state as the fundamental obligation. Next, but the obligation would have no influence over the behavior of state. But these obligations but these obligations would have no influence but these obligations would have no influence over the behavior of state. Over behavior of the state. Behavior of the state. Behavior of the state. Except when citizens happen to identify except when citizens happen to when citizens happen to Identify closely with the state. Identify closely with the state. Closely with the state. Next point. Next point. International laws purport. International laws purport. International laws purports to bind state, to bind not individual, not individual, not individual. Next point. Various conditions. Please keep in mind, international law is source of expectation about how state will act under various conditions. That only to understand state how work and do various act towards other state. Next. Individuals have obligation to keep their promises. Individual have an obligation individual have an obligation to keep their promises, to keep their promises, to keep their promises. Yes, today I am extremely very sorry for that. Okay, हो जाए थोड़ा, ये हो जाए बस. Okay, just do 10 point हो जाए. For example, a person should break a person should break a person should break should a person break a person should break a promise to help out in a scheme, to help out in a scheme, to help out in a scheme that turn out to be harmful, that turn out to be harmful. Make a promise to help out in a scheme that turn out to be harmful. Next. Next point. State is like a corporation. Next point. State is like corporation. State is like corporation, and corporation make promises, and corporation make promises, are obligated to keep them, are obligated obligated to keep them, to keep them. Next point. Next point. State are different from individual. States are different from individual. Different from individual. States are different from individual and corporation. Like Czechoslovakia from potential threat, now the powerful nation must decide whether to keep the promises. Next point. Domestic laws are good because they respect and promote the autonomy of citizens, or because they promote the weather of citizens. Next point is that state don't have project and life plans by a vote of its trustee. It was then signed by more than 200 leaders from 40 different faith traditions and spiritual communities during the Parliament 1993 gathering in Chicago. It has served as a common ground for peoples to discuss, to agree, to cooperate for the good of all. The founder of the Global Ethical Foundation, German, and President Stiftung Weltwirtschaft, founder for global ethics. Global ethics was defined as a field of theoretical inquiries that addresses ethical questions and problems arising out of the global interconnections and interdependence of the world population. On this account, global ethics investigate and the nation are danger of maneuvering themselves into crisis, which can ultimately lead to national collapse. For example, to economic ruin, social disintegrations, on political catastrophe. He claims that there are economic, political, ecological, or ethical obligations. The way to establish global ethics that will command the agreement of all peoples in the world is through dialogue between the world religious traditions, which will identify and articulate common values that are fundamental them all. Next point. Interreligious dialogue as a way of forward for global ethics. International religious dialogue. Interreligious dialogue as a way of interreligious dialogue as a way of forward for global ethics. Forward for global ethics.